thought motorways. I don't know who was the genius in the Department of Transport or wherever he was, or she, let's be honest, in the world, who came up with the line smart motorways, because they're anything but, aren't they? Yet another report now has been published which shows smart motorways, they are motorways without a hard shoulder, are 3 times more lethal to break down on than those that retain safety lanes. And the chance of such crashes resulting in minor injuries were nearly 2/3 higher on those roads too. That's according to the National Highways Analysis. It also emerged that life-saving technology, which is designed to alert traffic officers to vehicles marooned in the live lane, which used to be the hard shoulder, is missing as many as 100 incidents a month. So nothing smart about the motorway in the first place, and nothing smart about the equipment which is supposed to detect cars that have broken down. The stopped vehicle direct detection technology is flagging around 1,000 incidents monthly. So the National Highways report says that there is now a standstill on the development of new smart motorways, but we've already got 370 miles worth of smart motorways in use. So why on earth doesn't the government scrap them until they complete all their analysis? I'm going to talk now to Claire Mercer. She's from the campaign group Smart Motorways Kill, and she speaks from deeply troubling experience because her own husband, Jason Mercer, lost his life on the M1 in June 2019. Claire, good evening to you.
Hello.
You must despair. Yet another report telling you what you already know, that smart motorways are just, frankly, potentially lethal. Well, not even potentially lethal. The death threat, according to this latest report, trebles on some smart motorways. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's just absolutely ridiculous, because Highways England themselves even uploaded exactly the same report to social media yesterday morning, saying the stats show that smart motorways are getting safer. So they just cherry-picked the odd piece of information out of that report and picked that. It was 116 pages, and they cherry-picked. What they actually did is controlled motorways. They used the stats for controlled motorways, which is a smart motorway that does have a hard shoulder and the technology. So I'm all for controlled motorways. Anything that has a hard shoulder, that's what we're for. And they misrepresented the data. They chose just to focus on the data for controlled motorways, because technically that's a smart motorway, ignoring all lane running and dynamic. So they're cherry picking the data, but then when you look at it properly, you get the stats that you just mentioned, 3 times more likely and more likely to be injured as well. And so how could it be a good idea? And yet it's 116 pages of how to spend more of the public's tax money on bodge jobs and fixes, when the easiest, cheapest and far more effective thing to do would be to turn off the first lane, even just temporarily, just turn it off and use that as a quick fix until they get round to painting the solid white line back in permanently.
Claire, you lost your own husband on the M1 in June 2019. I'm sorry to ask you, but if you can bear it, can you tell us what happened to him?
Yeah, he'd just joined the motorway in Rotherham. He'd not got very far at all, only a few miles down the road near Meadowall in Sheffield. He had a minor bump with another motorist. It should have only ever been a minor inconvenience. They both should have come home that night. But because there was no hard shoulder for them to pull up onto, because there was a sign saying no hard shoulder for 4 miles. It didn't say, but there's an emergency refuge a mile out of sight. Because there's crash barriers hemming the vehicles in on a motorway, whereas there isn't on an A road, and because there was a 30-foot drop the other side of the crash barrier, all this left them two in very dangerous circumstances from what was just a minor bump. And the inevitable happened. They had to stay on the roads. They couldn't get their vehicle out of the live running lane. They couldn't get over the crash barrier because of the drop. And a lorry, which can't manoeuvre as quickly as a smaller vehicle, because in all these cases, it's almost always a HGV, because they can't manoeuvre as quickly as a car. The HGV ploughed into them and killed them instantly.
So your husband was killed instantly, and the other driver too?
Yeah, and he was only 22 years old. My husband was only 42. The other person was only 22.
And yet still, this government perseveres, continues with these wretched so-called smart motorways. They've put a stop on the development of new ones, Claire, as you know, partly down to the success of your campaign. But we've still got 370 miles of so-called smart motorway in other parts of England, which they're still using.
Yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, it's not a stop. They called it a pause on new development. And the pause is worth absolutely nothing because it didn't pause anything. Since they announced that about 3 months ago, so much more smart motorway has opened because they just declared every project substantially complete, even where they hadn't even broken ground, and gave themselves permission to carry on because they're a privatised government department, so they can just write their own checks, sign their own permissions, they can just do what they want. So they just declared everything substantially complete, and the pause is not worth the paper it's written on.
And the whole point of these stupid motorways, Claire, I understand, is to make sure traffic flows more smoothly, to try to ease congestion. And yet the figures show the number of fatalities on smart motorways are proportionately much higher than on the conventional motorway.
Yeah, I mean, I sat down with a pen and paper not long after my husband was killed, and I looked at the bumps that they'd given for the project around here, and I worked out that they justified the project in just this area on saving the average commuter 2 minutes a day on their commute. And
2 minutes.
2 minutes a day, that's what they were offering. But then, I mean, it's 2 minutes a day worth anybody's life. It's not worth one single person's life, never mind the several that have been killed on exactly that stretch already. But then all the people that were caught in the backlog from such a horrific accident, they were caught for hours and hours and hours. My husband was killed at 12 minutes past 8 in the morning. His body was still on the motorway at 5 o'clock in the evening. So, so they just lost all their 2 minutes for the entire year and well into the following year. So it just doesn't balance. It does not balance at all. And it's killing people. And they're just doubling down. They've spent so much of the taxpayers' money on this. And they've handed out so many massive private contracts. They can't own up now. They can't back down. And they're under enormous pressure from the private companies that win these contracts to not give in to me, I'm dismissed as this little irritant that they can't buy off with an OBE and that they can't get to shut up and go away. And they think that they'll just, manage to eventually get past me. And meanwhile, I'm taking them to the High Court. I'm taking them to disability discrimination. I'm challenging the police decisions not to prosecute them. I'm not going to shut up and go away, and I will win, but they're spending more of our money while they try and ignore me.
The other problem too, Claire, and we're glad you're not going to give in because you're fighting a great campaign, the investigation last year that found 1 in 10 of the safety cameras on these so-called smart motorways were either broken, misted up, or, God help us, facing the wrong way.
Yep. Some of them are even just facing directly upwards or directly downwards because just things as simple as the brackets have broken. And when they actually looked at where Jason was killed, which was one of the most horrific incidents in recent times, because there's a lot of detail they didn't release about that, but all I can say to you is that in these incidents, the people aren't in their vehicles, they're stood by the side of the road, and you just don't even want to imagine what a 40-ton truck does to the human body. But even at that junction, 2 years after the most horrific incident in recent time, a quarter of the equipment wasn't working. So they don't care that, I am fighting this campaign. I am a pain in their bums, and they just won't. They don't even pretend to even maintain the equipment where that incident happened.
When will you be in the High Court with them, Claire? Do you know? Have you got a date?
Not yet. It is taking so long. It's always a long process, and then COVID really, made it a very long process. But I am being told we will get a date sometime very soon. We are now at the final hurdle, and the next stage is the date.
Well, Claire, make sure you let us know when it happens, and of course LBC will be there. We'll cover it, as will all the mainstream media. Claire Mercer, thank you for joining us, and once again, condolences about losing your husband and losing him in such a brutal way. Claire Mercer's husband Jason died on the M1 in June 2019, hit by a 40-ton truck. The other driver killed too, instantly. Where could they go? Where could they go? A 30-foot drop over the other side of the crash barrier. 3 lanes of motorway, cars speeding at great speed. That they saw a sign saying nowhere to stop for 4 miles, and struck by a 40-ton lorry. Isn't the point? Smart motorways are dangerous, and the government is irresponsible in keeping them, in planning to develop more, and keeping the 375 miles, which are already up and running, keeping them going. What's your view? Have you travelled on a smart motorway? Have you ever been, do you know people, families, drivers, who've been caught in similar or experiences on the smart motorways? Number to call, 0345 6060 973. Text